Welcome back, and welcome back to our final panel session, which is Countdown to 2030, Leveraging AI to Unlock the Power of Data for Better Lives for All. For this session, we will have Craig Hammer, Senior Program Manager at the World Bank, as our moderator. And I'd also like to welcome Christopher Maloney, Program Officer in the Gender Equity and Governance Program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Christine Qiang, Global Director for Digital Development at the World Bank, Peter Addo, Head of Emerging Tech Lab at Agence française de développement, and Samuel Annim, Government Statistician in the Ghana Statistical Service.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, audience, for staying with us. This has been quite an amazing 2 days. Or 1.5 days. And thank you also to our YouTube streaming audience, truly also for staying with us. The numbers have been very, very good. About 150 people so far this morning have been watching us. And so it's been a really good opportunity, I think, to have an important conversation about the intersection of data and AI. And you have waited for a good reason, because this is the best session in the entire event. The most important discussion has just about to begin. So congratulations to all of you, and thanks again for joining. So we have had quite a winding road these last 2 days. I think if you remember yesterday, we started off quite optimistically. I think it was on the order of 90% of the people in the room had an optimistic feeling about the future of AI for sustainable development. The discussion wound around a bit, and we got into a bit of a Joseph Conradian, well, it's more of a riddle wrapped in a mystery, hidden in an enigma. And I think now the point of this discussion is to take a more forward-looking approach to the agenda, to think about what the implications of this are for the Sustainable Development Goals, more specifically for the 2030 agenda, now that we are past the halfway point, to think about how AI tools can help countries potentially bridge data gaps to the points that were raised yesterday and partially this morning, how we can potentially leapfrog legacy digital technology and generate more and better insights in service of the 2030 agenda and the priorities it represents. And then, importantly, how we get from here to there. So, thank you, panelists, for your time and in anticipation of a really interesting discussion. Christine, let me begin with you. You are the most important person at the World Bank because you are leading the digital transformation agenda. And so what we're interested in is what the World Bank is doing right now and what foundational investments are underway and will be coming to support the building blocks for AI readiness in country partners.
Great. Thank you, Greg, first, and also to Haishan for inviting me to this very interesting panel, and also with a very distinguished panel group. So before I talk about, what the bank is doing in this area, maybe I just want to first refer to our joint product together, between digital and data, is the WDR 2021. So everybody probably knows about this Data for Better Lives. So that report really looked at, the enablers, the safeguards, and identified the opportunities. And of course, we also note that the report was published before the generative AI, right? So we are already in a very different world. So I just want to mention 3 things that is the context where the World Bank is thinking about what we should do in the AI and data area, especially the interface. The first one is really about the time frame, right? The time frame of disruptive technologies that impact the world. If we look at the previous generations of digital technologies, such as fixed phone, it took actually 75 years, right, to reach 100 million people. But in the case of, the mobile phone, I just want to give you some numbers to, give the context. In the mobile phone, it was 16 years. And then for World Wide Web, 7 years. For Apple App Store, 2 years. And for ChatGPT, it was 2 months. So it was 2 months to reach 100 million people. So I really think we are in a very different world. I think we need to understand what is happening. So for a development agency, we see a lot of opportunities, innovations, and also transformation. As Greg, you said, right, it offers leapfrogging opportunities. So that's the first context I want to mention. The second one is really the interface between data and AI. Because AI, if you put it simply, it's about data computing. So how we look at data computing, we need to connect to data hosting and data sharing. So that's the public data infrastructure that is really foundational for every countries, right? So that's the second context that I just want to mention. So that, when I talk about the 3 areas we want to invest, the dots can be connected. The last point on the context is really about the digital divide. So I was at the World Mobile Congress in Barcelona last month in February. So at every corner, in every booth, in every single meeting, AI was mentioned. I think the World Bank was one of the few voices there to remind everybody of 2 things. One, obviously, is the risks in terms of governance, but the other is really to our heart is technologies, however wonderful they are, they also accelerate the digital divide. So let's not forget, whatever we decide to invest, whatever we decide to do, we need to remember who may be left behind. So these are the context points. But in terms of where the World Bank should be doing on AI to support our clients, I think it's still a very beginning of a journey. So Haishan and I, we were just chatting before this panel. We want to work together because it's an agenda, it's hard to predict. And we don't really know where things are going to have the impact, and you also know a lot of misinformation. So we want to support the client in a way because the capacity is also relatively low on their side. Therefore, the first area we want to invest as the bank is really about capacity building. We will not probably have the bandwidth to educate or help every single individual, every single business to build the AI capacity, maybe through some of our projects to reach a certain part of the population and businesses. But one focus that we're having is really about capacity building of policymakers. Because policymakers need to understand the overall direction of AI and the implication of the whole development strategy. The second area we want to invest more is obviously the governance part. I'm sure throughout the sessions, people talk a lot about governance of AI and also the global governance across borders, right? Because AI and data, there's really no boundary, right? No borders for these topics. And when we look at countries that are relatively successful in terms of AI adoption, such as South Korea, Canada, China, and many others, they do share a common feature is that they have a broad strategic direction, and they know what they want to do. Although if you look at the governance models, they all differ, right? Some are more tightly controlling or governing from the top. Others are more kind of wait and see and let the industry do the self-regulation. But we really want to understand the models and work with the countries together on the governance, but also play this convening role on the cross-border global governance. Just last point where we want to invest is obviously on infrastructure, because ultimately if you don't have fast broadband connectivity, if we do not have data infrastructure like the cloud capability and computing power, if we do not have the data content, none of the opportunities will be realized. So Craig, I will stop here. Of course, I can give a lot examples if we have time later.
If you would, we would like that. Prof, I'm going to come to you. As the most important person in Ghana's statistical service, now, the idea that Ghana has embraced AI solutions and opportunities is very exciting. I would wonder if you could speak a bit more to that vision and what kinds of transformations you're seeing or that you see need to happen in order for that vision to be achieved.
Thank you very much, Craig, and good morning. Yes, and thank you for having me for the second time on the stage. Craig, permit me I run the risk of repeating some of the things I said yesterday, but for purposes of clarity and consistency, I want to emphasize the fact that the conversation from our point of view should not look at the development part of AI, but I want to focus more on issues around integration and the redistribution aspect of it. Before I get into the vision, I wear another hat at the UN level where it's always important to begin to think about things that should happen at the global level. Craig, it's important we underscore this conversation with the fact that a number of countries have seen digitalization without statistics. Although they've seen digitalization with data, and the definition of data is nebulous, varies from one agency to another, but the real digitalization that we saw and we've had in the last 1.5 days, a number of countries have seen digitalization without statistics. That is why, from my point of view, administrative data in some countries is still at its early stages. I bring this to the fore because we run the risk globally of seeing AI in so many respects, sitting at a conference like this, talking about AI and data, and in our minds, some of us will be thinking that data and statistics can be used interchangeably, but the risk really here is that AI can happen, can advance the world in certain respects, but the inequality that we're talking about will simply be a matter that AI and statistics have not well been connected. Given these perspectives, Craig, my point is that as we've done for certain innovations within the statistical world, we should begin to think about how we can develop frameworks for countries to think about how national statistical offices can better get connected with AI. And this is all the issue that we're talking about in terms of the legal framework, the artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. Permit me to be blunt on this matter. And Haishan, you remember during the New York meeting, I approached you. On the 18th of March, the managing director for IMF visited Ghana, and there was a conference on how we can use AI as a catalyst to transform economies in Africa. As a national statistician, I got to hear this after some days when the event had happened. And I raised this with Haishan earlier on during the UN that we still have instances where we have these international agencies coming into the country, knowing very well that the pivotal agency is the National Statistical Office, but all these things happen without the National Statistical Office sitting in the middle of the conversation. And that is why I started with that background information. Now to my question on the vision. For Ghana Statistical Service, we really want to demonstrate the power of AI from two perspectives. As I indicated, from an integrative perspective where we bring in agencies together, and from the redistribution perspective. We think that we don't have the clouds to influence what should be the roadmap, what should be the policy, who should bring who on board, and who is going to drive it. But the only thing we can do is, as statisticians, have an evidence-based approach. So our vision is, how do we demonstrate the power of data from the perspective of AI? And as I said, focusing on only the integrative part of it and the redistribution part of it. I'll quickly mention a couple of things that we've done in the recent past. Yesterday, I mentioned the national data partnerships. One way of ensuring an integrative approach to data statistics, AI, and the non-traditional analytics that I talked about is when we are sure that we have a central data point that brings all of us together. So we are consciously signing MOUs, metadata arrangements, mapping of statistical products across all government ministries to ensure that we have a seamless approach where we have all the data that I talked about coming to sit on our statistical online bank. Just last week, another intervention that we thought about related to what I said yesterday is we engaged the Finance Committee of Parliament, and we said to them that we have just one ask from you. And that ask is that before you approve of any policy, just do two things for us. make sure that that policy has basic statistical profiling. Are there statistical targets in there? Can those statistical targets be met? The numbers in there, are they consistent with numbers that sit across all the government agencies? And do we have a strategy for evaluating it? And the second thing we requested from them is that if that policy had existed before and it hasn't been evaluated, don't pass it. Then the third thing that we're doing, which we hope to continue, is that we want to make sure that we have capacity that is resident in the country when it comes to data science. We all know how rare this capacity is, especially those of us in the global south. In 2022, we recruited 9 people. 6 months after we've built their capacity, 3 of them left. So we really need to have a strategy. So one way we are going to ensure that is that in the next couple of years, we're going to make sure that it's not only resident in the Ghana Statistical Service, it's resident in the entire national statistical system. We're going beyond that and make sure that it's resident in the academic community and in the media space as well. So this is what we are doing to ensure that that vision to demonstrate that AI can transform livelihoods and, more importantly, break that cyclical fluctuations in our development is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Wow is right, Peter. So no, I mean, I think and it is eye-opening what you've said. I think part of what we also have to realize, and as Dermot said yesterday, it's incumbent on organizations like this to ensure that statistics are not the second-class citizens of the AI conversation, and to ensure that the intersection of the data revolution and the AI revolution is widely understood in order to make sure that both agendas are prioritized and that the right key counterparts are involved in both. So speaking of technical frameworks to ensure that national statistics offices and key government counterparts are involved and which can help enable engagement with AI. Peter, as the most important person at AFD, you co-authored a policy paper called Emergency Uses of Technology for Development, a New Intelligence Paradigm. Could you talk a bit about that framework, the new forms of intelligence you identified, the 4 I's, and share some examples of the kind of benefits you'd identified in the development arena?
Thanks a lot, and thanks, Christine and Samuel, for setting the stage. I think you said a lot of things that probably we'll touch later during the conversation. Thanks also for the opportunity to learn and share and engage. Concerning the report, so this was a report on emerging uses of technology for development that we worked with the NYU Governance Lab, I think 2 years ago. And we all agree that development challenges are quite complex, they are urgent, and also they are virtually nonlinear, dynamic, and interdependent, right? And our conversations yesterday actually pointed out to some of these challenges. And we also heard that they are pretty slow. There are also risk of aversion, that we don't invest pretty fast. And so it means that we started thinking about this and we said, we need to find new ways of innovating, right? So there's a need for innovation to be able to deal with some of these barriers that does not help us move forward or progress in line with that. And some of these barriers obviously are trust, resource constraint, and reach. So in the work, we came to a realization that the emerging uses of these technologies can enable new forms of intelligence, right? So these new forms of intelligence, we classified it under 4 groups, right? So the first one was on data intelligence, which covers open data, data collaboratives, and the rest. The second one was artificial intelligence, which is quite evident. And then the third one is on collective intelligence, right? So technologies that really enable us to work together, right? Like crowdsourcing, crowd law, co-creation, citizen science, most of these digital commons, right? And then, which will also help in public engagement, right? And then the fourth one was really centered on what we call the embodied intelligence, right? So embodied intelligence Examples are much more like AI robots, drones used in agriculture, 3D printing, which we actually saw during the COVID crisis. And then we realized that these forms of intelligence do have great value propositions in development. COVID, we noticed that we needed a lot of situational awareness, right? So, and our friend from World Data Lab actually pointed out some of the things that some of these forms of intelligence can help us actually move forward. So it can enhance knowledge and situational awareness, and also create new forms of assessment that for impact assessment and results, which is sometimes a big challenge for development players. We keep asking ourselves whether these investments that we're doing, do we really have the impact, right? Is this what the population is actually requesting for? And then probably a third point will be it increases legitimacy in our works, right? So the report actually concludes with 6 principles. The first one is on whether it's fit for purpose, right? So I think that's a very I think that's always the first part. I keep receiving requests from project officers, country officers on do we use blockchain? Do we use, I don't know, it keeps coming up. And the question is, do we really have the right framing of questions, right, to use some of these technologies? So, and does it really adapt to the local context? So that's one. The second one, do we have local assets? Someone actually pointed out to developing data science, science profiles. Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the right policies to be able to ensure that it is done? So, and then the third point, which is on timeliness, whether some of these technologies or new forms of intelligence, if used, will lead to the value proposed in that particular initiative, right? So you can have a very nice proposal, but the time to realization of this project, is it worth using such a technology? And then we talked about maturity, the risk and benefits, and then lastly on governance, which is pretty cool. So I'll stop now, and then probably we can have follow-up discussions. Thanks.
I think it's very heartening to hear the kind of consonance that's coming out of these discussions in terms of where the demands and priorities are and how organizations like ours are responding to that demand. And so with that, Chris, as the most important person at Hewlett, could you please speak to the strategy for gender equity and governance program? The program had released a strategy which references support for the use of AI technologies in your country partners. Could you speak to the kind of AI priorities that you would defined on the basis of country demand, and what Hewlett is doing to respond to that?
Great, thanks for that, Craig. And if you could just tell my boss that I'm the most important person at Hewlett.
Consider it done. Yes.
So maybe just to very quickly step back and talk a little bit about what the Hewlett Foundation is doing in this space. So I co-lead the Hewlett Foundation's grant making in what we call evidence-informed policy making in Africa, where our goal is really to support grantees, primarily based on the African continent, that are promoting the consistent, responsible use of inclusive data and evidence in policymaking in East and West Africa. We care about that for 2 reasons. One, I think we firmly believe that if policymakers are using more data and evidence in their decision making, that leads to better developmental outcomes and enhanced people's well-being. But the other piece of this I think is really important, and hopefully we touched a little bit about it today, is also I think it does a lot to improve the trust that's ever fraying between policymaker and citizen. And so this is a small but mighty portfolio, about $20 million per year, spread across 60 grantees, and as I said, the majority of whom are African-led, African-based organizations. And that's, I think, really important because it's from them that we really understand where we're investing and what our priorities should be. I sit in a fog-filled eucalyptus forest in California. I'm about as far removed from the challenges that we're trying to address, and so really my job is to spend a lot of time on the road meeting these amazing grantees, writing the check, and getting out of the way. So what you hear from me today is really what's coming from them. And so our grant making is essentially in 3 distinct areas. So the first is really around supporting African organizations that are producing and intermediating new and different sources of data and evidence for policymaking. The second is really doubling down on grantees that are both advocating for policymakers to use data and evidence, but also building their capacity to do so. So it's one thing to produce it, you got to think about this, the demand side as well. And then the third piece is, I think, something I really love about this forum. It's about the ecosystem play and primarily around breaking down these very weird silos that are in this space. So whether that's the divide between data and stats, or stats and data and digital, or even going farther into the world of evaluation and RCTs, all of these communities need to be talking to each other, and so we really want to work with grantees who are trying to break down those silos. So with that chapeau, what does this actually mean from an AI standpoint? So I think Luis put it best in our last session from OECD when he said, really need to think about AI as just part of this bundle, right? So at the end of the day, if we're investing in data, that's just the blood that's flowing through AI, right? And so it's just yet another deep, complicated wrinkle in the data space, at least where I come from. And so that's how it's kind of manifesting more than anything else. The grant-making buckets haven't changed. It's more about how our grantees are evolving in terms of what they do and what they're supporting. So to give you some concrete examples of that, what we're hearing, what we're seeing, on that producer side, we really are trying to find, and it's been exciting to see over the past 10 years, the expansion of proximate African AI grantees. So I have one in Uganda named Sunbird AI that has developed local noise sensing technologies and working with mayors in second-tier cities in Uganda to help them understand noise pollution issues in their spatial planning, for example. They're also developing some fascinating local language models that can be used for testing basically customer response to service delivery in some of the most far-flung parts of the country. From a capacity building standpoint, I think we're seeing that on two fronts. One, and I love the conversation yesterday about framework palooza. There are lots and lots of frameworks. I have lots of grantees working on frameworks, but what they're doing is taking it one level down to make it much more proximate and relevant from an Afrocentric point of view. So one of my grantees based in Kenya, Policy, P-O-L-L-I-C-Y, if you haven't seen it, they just released it yesterday. They did a case study of 5 different African countries looking at the state of gender data governance and taking a distinctive Afrofeminist lens to it, and have put forward a 5-pillar framework on what an Afrofeminist lens might look like when you think about gender data governance. So that's an idea of sort of taking that down to one more level of specificity to make it more relevant for policymakers across the continent. But the capacity building side also matters, and that's trying to make and invest in spaces that are really pulling policymakers into the conversations where they can feel safe to talk about very controversial issues and reveal what they don't know. And so a great example of that is I have investments right now with the DataSphere initiative, which has created the Africa Forum for sandboxes. And so they're looking at a sandbox on AI, a sandbox on health data, and really getting policymakers from across Africa and from the RECs to explore through regulatory and operational sandboxes what could be solutions in these spaces. And then finally, on the ecosystem play, I think the interesting thing here is AI is forcing all of these silos to naturally come together organically, whether we like it or not. And so that's been very good. So I think thinking through the types of grantees who can make that happen more quickly and on specific topics. So for example, we have grants right now to GRAIN, which is the Gender and AI Network Africa, which is pulling together members from across the different silos in this space to explore these topics. I just want to end by just also flagging one really important thing that I mentioned at the beginning, and I hope we continue to talk about, which is this issue of power. So those of you who might have been at World Data Forum in Hangzhou last year, I still stand by what I said there, which is data and evidence are forms of power. Whose data, what data is used, what data is not used, those are all exercises of power. And sometimes the asymmetries in that space are important, but sometimes they're very dangerous. And so from a Hewlett standpoint, whenever I'm making a grant, thinking explicitly about the power dynamics that I am aiding and abetting is really, really important. And so from that, I've developed a sub-portfolio of about 15 African think tanks, universities, researchers that are really trying to shape the African response to the global battle on data governance. I don't think the answer in Africa is necessarily the Wild West of the US. It's hyper-focused on the firm. I don't think the answer is China, where it's hyper-focused on the state, nor do I think it's necessarily focused on the European model, which is really about the individual and the human-centric standpoint. There's something in the middle where finding that balance between data for development on one side and the rights and privacy and data on the other is better in the African context. Now, what does that look like? Again, I don't have the answer sitting in California, but my grantees do. And so thinking through what that looks like in reality is a big part as well, what I worry about. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We'll in a moment go to some audience questions. So for those of you who may wish to ask a question, please do think about them. And then if you would begin lining up in the interim, Peter, if you'd like to descend the dais and ask a question, that's also entirely up to you. Sorry. But in the interim, so please do begin lining up. I'd like to ask Christine. So we've heard about how dynamic a space this agenda is, and how much work is happening in different parts of the world, how many different centers of gravity there are. And I'm interested in your view on how the World Bank can align and what the comparative advantage of the bank may be relative to our partners in providing value in this space.
We actually really see this is a space, I think some of the panelists also mentioned, right? It's almost like a natural alliance that bring different parts together because the knowledge is quite limited and everybody sees the potential. So, I was discussing with Haishan before this as well, right, is that naturally the people who actually want to explore the opportunities will come together. And of course, we all have our own different comparative advantages. Let me just give you two examples. One is how does the bank work with private sector together, right? Is that private sector, they are always the frontier. They are the drivers of innovation behind technology. So what we gain from talking to them is one is to learn about the technology trend that will inform our thinking, that will inform also our advice to our country clients on the big direction. But the second thing that we get from working with private companies, but also with IFC within MIGA, within our own organization, we have this One World Bank Group approach, is that how do we actually bring ideas to the design and the implementation? Because that will count on the technology solutions that they will develop for our countries. Because ultimately, they will bring technology, expertise, but they will also test the market, right, and see whether the solutions are applicable for the different countries, but more importantly, whether they are sustainable, right? Because without a market test, we can do 100 pilots in 200 countries, but the scalability and sustainability will never be there. So that's one example on how we work with private sector. The other example is actually how we work with our own UN agencies, right? Because, I talked a little bit before about convening, but in the AI area, actually our UN agencies are playing a very big role on, bringing all the countries together. Look at, for example, the principles that we mentioned earlier. There's AI principle. There's also digital safeguards principle. I think these discussions are, of course, very time-consuming. But given, it has a lot of ethical use questions, a lot of, competition, power of markets. So I think it's really important to have these discussions to really get everybody's view. And then at the end, I think the idea is that through the Global Digital Compact, then we will have a few principles for AI, principles for, safeguards, that at least reached, I would say, 80% consensus. It's never probably going to be 100%, but I think having the 80% consensus, that will be guidelines then for the private sector, for the World Bank, but also for civil societies and for everybody to a bit abide by these principles as we continue to explore the opportunities and to mitigate the risks.
Thank you, Christine. Do we have a question? I see Shaida heading to the mic.
Yes.
And here comes Dunstan. Fantastic.
Thanks.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you. Please go ahead, Shaida.
Thanks. It's been fascinating. My question is actually for many of you, but it stems from some of the comments that Sam made. Sam was basically making a very strong case for influencing, being able to have organizations like National Statistical Office of Ghana to be influencing this agenda for the country and, of course, influencing at many levels. And my question for the group would be, so what can we do to support groups like like Ghana, National Statistical Office, and SAM for increasing their influence? Is it a question of legitimacy? He has the legitimacy, but maybe it should be changed. Or is it a question of leadership? He's one of the best leaders I've met. So that's there. Does he have instruments and financing? And so what do we need? Does he have the right connections? So I would really appreciate comments from your group. Thanks.
Thank you, Shaida. Let's take the next question, and then we can organize some responses.
Hi, my name is Johnston. Yeah, I'm back. I have a question for Christine. And so I think you mentioned that one of the priorities for the bank when it comes to AI is to focus on capacity building, to teach our partners, the policymakers, to understand AI as a technology, I guess to understand the capabilities, the limits, the biases, the limitations, right? And that makes sense, and I do agree. But still, my question is on data, right? I think as it's been mentioned in the forum, one of the challenges with this for low-income countries with low resource languages is lack of data. And one of the reasons for that is just like there's no digitalization. So the data is there, but it's believe it or not, it's still in hard copy format, right? So I was just curious, like, what about investing in helping these countries to digitize the data, to bring this low resource language data together? Is that one of the, are you considering that as one of the focus areas as well?
Thanks, Johnston. We'll take the next question.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Elise Egan. I'm a senior policy advisor on aid transparency at USAID. I feel like yesterday we heard a lot from some of the private sector representatives that were invited to speak. And to Chris's point on power, Christine's point on how the bank can leverage the power that the private sector has here. I'm wondering if we can speak a bit more frankly about what levers those of us in the public sector and the international space have to really put pressure on the power, where I see it as very much lying with the private sector right now in this conversation. What incentives do they have, really, to listen to us on these dangers and implement safe and policies that are going to lead to a better world? Thank you.
Thank you, Elise. Oh, okay, I think that we can keep going with the next two questions, and then we'll have some responses.
Thank you. I am Elisa Cabrera from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, part of the Organization of American States. And I work on freedom of expression, human rights, privacy, and internet. My question is, first of all, we've been having trouble or challenges identifying inside states, so in states bureaucracies, people who are able to step up and participate of high-level discussions on data governance, internet, and privacy, and this sort of issues that we are discussing here. So I wanted to hear more about the experience of Hewlett in Africa. You mentioned about this network in the entire continent with different actors. How is the state participation in that network? And how can we assure that it's not only platforms, the private sector, the big bank, organization, development, foundations that participate and have a say? How do we ensure that states have also the capacity to participate and make decisions, and the global South or Africa and Latin America not only absorb and try to copy paste what's being done in Europe and in other countries? Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beverly Hatcher-Mbu. I'm a Deputy Director of Programs at Development Gateway and IREX Venture. Little background, we're a group of nonprofit technologists who build and support and scale civic technology in the global South. My question is around interoperability. We're seeing a gap between where we are and where we'd like to be around AI. And I'm curious in each of your contexts how you're thinking about interoperability holistically, not just the interconnection of data, but the interconnection of systems, of infrastructure in particular, and of people and processes. Because a lot of our dreams around AI aren't possible unless we are scaling existing data and existing systems to be able to use that data in new ways. So that you can take this very broadly, but I think each of you, I'd love to hear from the Statistics Commission, from Hewlett, from Agence française, and from the bank, how you're thinking about that.
Thank you very much. And so we have a range of questions. Let's come to our panelists first, in case there are any more after this round, if we have more time. I'm going to take the liberty of going in reverse order, if that's okay. So it'll be Chris, Peter, Prof, and then Christine. If you could speak to the questions that most percolate to the surface of your consciousness and the result of this very, very excellent array of questions. Please do go ahead.
Great. I'm going to answer the two questions, the one on the public sector levers and the one on sort of the ecosystem play and on the privacy human rights standpoint. I'm going to talk about my favorite data and AI disaster of 2023, and I'm probably going to get pieces of this story wrong, so please forgive me, but it's just such a great example of how complicated things are right now. So in the summer of 2023, if you were in a ruralish part of Kenya or the smaller cities, you would have seen lots of largely farmers who are not connected to the internet lining up, getting their irises scanned by these very creepy silver balls. And what this was Sam Altman of OpenAI has a crypto firm called WorldCoin. And the way the proof of personhood will work in WorldCoin is by training AI on lots and lots and lots and lots of irises so that it can distinguish between human irises and robots. So Sam Altman needs lots and lots of irises. What better idea than to go to Africa and scan people's irises in exchange for $50 equivalent in crypto? Now, how this all happened is a very, very live issue in Kenya right now. But needless to say, this raised a lot of eyebrows, no pun intended, in Kenya as this was going on, because you had literally hundreds of thousands of people. Literally, there were reports of small riots in some of these states falling over themselves to get their irises scanned. It also created a shadow industry of people coming up from Nairobi who actually were connected to the internet and understood crypto to then like have this shady thing where they would take the crypto that were given and then giving them shillings cash. A lot of my civil society groups are now involved in strategic litigation against WorldCoin. The parliament and the government immediately shut this down. But it's thrown into relief two very different perspectives on what went wrong here, right? If you talk to probably most of those farmers, scan all the irises, take all your biometrics you want. Like, I'm not connected to the internet. I don't care. $50 is a lot of money. If you talk to a lot of my finance tech bro friends in San Francisco, they'll say, we are helping Kenya and the poorest of the poor leapfrog from a financial inclusion standpoint. How dare you, hold them back this way? If you talk to my CSO friends, human rights and privacy has been abused. If you read these contracts, and this is true, the only way that if you don't want to dispute to get control back of your biometrics is you have to use a pre-approved arbitrator from OpenAI's choice in San Francisco physically. So why would they do it this way? Like that to me just sort of smokes of just the latest version of data extractivism. Why would you need to pay for that? What are they doing with this data? Why have such a strange legal agreement? This came up at lunch yesterday when I was with my colleague from Meta who spoke yesterday, and she says, honestly, these were lawyers who probably weren't even thinking about that. Like, there's no nefarious intent here, and that's also probably true too. But at the end of the day, this, I think, is showing how kind of complicated and convoluted this all is, because what's been really sad is the person who's been hurt most by this, I would argue, and she's not here, so I don't want to, feel bad, but is the Data Protection Commission of Kenya. Because the parts of the government that were involved in getting the permits to get these iris scanners and had nothing to do with DPC. And so the proper channels weren't followed, but it looks like she was asleep at the job. And this is where building the capacity and the powers of the data protection commissions, the DPCs in Africa and globally, frankly, is so important. They're wildly under-resourced. Like, if you've ever met the DPC of Uganda, she sits in the back of Nita U in this like 2 cubicle space. She has almost no budget, and that's the classic thing you see over and over and over again. So from a Hewlett standpoint, doing things that can create the spaces that raise their profiles and get a stronger network from the DPCs, I think, can go a long way on these power questions and trying to find this balance between the innovations that are going on that are really exciting, but ensuring that it's done in a transparent and fair and equitable way, right? And so I think two examples that I can give you what this means concretely for us is we have investments right now in a Smart Africa, UNECA, and Digital Impact Alliance partnership called the African Data Leadership Initiative, or ADLI, which is involving 13 African countries, mid to senior level policymakers focused on data, and creating a Chatham House space for them to engage with almost entirely African-based think tanks and organizations and civil society advocates that are working on hot topics in data governance and AI, so they can discuss in a safe space what the issues are, where the capacity building needs are, and be vulnerable, frankly, because you need that type of thing. The other piece, of course, is NADPA, which is this growing network of DPCs across Africa so they can learn from each other and understand different ways of advocating for themselves. So it is a long journey. There is a huge way to go, but I just want to talk about just some of these gluey type things, these safe spaces that we can create that can help build a sort of nascent space that needs a lot of help.
Thanks, Chris. Peter.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll start with the issue of the influence. I think that was the first question that was being raised. How? I don't have a straight answer to it, but I can give you some ideas on how countries can move forward on that. I think one of the first and has to do with literacy, digital literacy. We held an event, I think that was 2 years ago, where a member of parliament was saying, if we do not even understand what AI and data is, how do we have the right policies? How do we bring the right people on the table? So I think digital awareness can help boost this particular challenge that Samuel might face. Another thing will be if the national statistical organizations can organize dialogues, right? Dialogues like what we have here, where they showcase some of the valued proposition of bringing organizations like this and then to policymaking, right? How national statistical organizations can move data policy to actions, right? So have events like this where you bring these policymakers to the table, private sector to the table, a lot of academia to the table, and then show the value propositions that you can bring to the to policymaking that can also move to actions. And in doing this, it is also important to have a system of more like a shared innovation where you can learn from examples that have been done in other countries, right? Success stories, and obviously the failed test, what did not work, so that policymakers also understand the risk of not involving organizations like that, right, on the table, and that can also help. And obviously experimentations, just like Yusuf also talked about, can also boost the influence. So that's what I can say on that for now. There was a question on interoperability, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So on this question, I don't know. I don't have a straight answer, but I can give you some ways of moving forward on it. It's pretty broad. So firstly, I think experimenting on data sandboxes, right? And then probably mutual commitment frameworks, like establishment mutual committing frameworks could be a way of helping in that sense. Another point will be what we have started doing. We've started trying to establish a framework for data reuse, right? So how do we have templates for data sharing? How do we have new models for consentment, right? When we even have these data sandboxes, how are we going to do that, right? Do we have a community-based approach to doing that? So this could be another way of doing it to boost trust, and also the issue about data sovereignty and all those stuff. So that's what I can say for now, and then I'll keep it short. Next.
Prof, and we'll come to you after that.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I would also pick the same two questions as Peter did. And Shada, thank you for the question, and I must commend the interventions that international organizations have put in place to strengthen National Statistical Office, particularly the leadership program that Pari 21 is leading, the open data that you want to do to ensure that there is some benchmark. This is a conversation that we can go on and on, but I just want to pick on two of them and elaborate more on one. The issue of independence of national statistical offices, I think, has been nebulously defined. And once we say independence, we are not too sure what goes into the ingredients of it, whether you have control over your human resource, whether you have control over the statistical independence in terms of the technical part. Unfortunately, we have defined it from a professional independence point of view without looking at the support aspect of it, that is the HR. Ghana Statistical Service for a 6-year period never recruited somebody because of various reasons. And I always argue that a National Statistical Office going for more than 5 years without recruiting is just not right. I mean, it means that over that period, you are not injecting any new brains, you are not circulating any new brains, and that is a challenge. The part that I want to touch on is what I talked about earlier on in terms of transforming the statistical products of national statistical offices. And I was talking to my colleague Yusuf earlier on, and it's one of my dilemma. I'm going to cite 3 examples. The World Bank and obviously other organizations keep saying that countries in the global south are agrarian. And you think about the fact that these countries are agrarian, and including Ghana, for more than 3 decades, we don't do agricultural census, we don't do agricultural surveys. I think that conversation is now changing. But this is a dilemma to me, and we are continuously out producing statistics at the aggregate level and using them for GDP and all the things that we think about. This conversation that we've had in the last 1.5 days, it's just about productivity. AI is about productivity. Go around and let's ask the number of countries that are producing statistics on productivity. And the third one that is a dilemma for me, which I know with certainty we are not producing in developing countries, is the issue of distribution. And all of us here as economists, we know the implications of inequalities irrespective of the growth that we have. That is why we continue to see growth without poverty, proper growth not happening in a number of our countries, simply because we measure inequality anytime we do LSMS every 5 years. The economy is hugely informal, and we don't know how distribution is affecting the growth rate that we see. So really, it is about time we reorient ourselves on the kind of statistics that we produce, and that's the point that I made earlier on. And we are expecting that the international community will begin to think about how we can make national statistical offices, as I said, the knowledge hub of the country. The policymakers would always look at the aggregates. It's only the national statistician that can explain that this particular crop is growing in terms of yield, and at the same time prices are going up, simply because you are not looking at intermediary factors like transportation, distribution, and so on. But if you take just the aggregate, then the policymaker is just saying that, yes, production is going up, inflation is coming up, then something is wrong. And that is what breeds mistrust. And that is why in Ghana we do one simple thing. We are saying that for all development partners, leverage the voice of GSS in every meeting that you sit. So every quarter we meet with development partners, we meet with the UN agencies and ask them what are the various things that they are doing and how we can even use AI to ensure that we bring all of these things together. Because now there's a disconnect between the data that the development partners are collecting, the UN agencies are collecting, and what sits with the national statistical offices. And this is where we need to get going if we really want to harmonize and coordinate things that we do. Craig, the second one on interoperability, I keep asking myself, interoperability for what? Unfortunately, the conversation around interoperability is so short-sighted. We want to be interoperable in terms of data sharing. We want to be interoperable in terms of IT systems. We want to harmonize our policies. Any conversation on interoperability that doesn't think about the end goal, which is the SDGs, I don't think that conversation should start. So if we want to really deal with interoperability, the conversation is, what is the end goal? The end goal is that we want to see transformation of lives. Otherwise, you're going to get a systems running, you're going to get a data running, and as I said, statistics will not happen. Evaluation will not happen. Transformation of lives will not happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Christine.
First of all, this is really a set of very thoughtful questions, so thank you all. I'll be brief because I'm the last and probably between you and lunch, so I'll just pick a few points. The first is really on data digitalization, and I couldn't agree more with the colleague who asked the question, because this is a quite integral component of many of the World Bank projects, is to help our counterpart agencies to digitalize the data first. And I also think, as my previous panelist just mentioned, right, statistical office is really a good example, because you need to digitalize the data first, and then you're able to actually develop the data analytics product. And then, as we all know, right, data is power. And if you have, good services, good products, and if the data is being used for policy making, then the value of any agency will also be enhanced. This is what we're doing not only with statistical offices, but with many offices around the world. I'll give you an example. It was in the 2000s. I was working in investment climate, and I went to a business registries office and in Africa, and it's like a full room of papers, right? Have to go through the papers together. But we did it together. We sit down, we went through all the papers, and now, of course, 20 years later, most of our business registry offices that we supported are already digitalized, right? It's just one example, but indeed, I think, ultimately is that how do we transform data, right, into useful products and services is what we are aiming for many of our projects. Interesting on the power and power with private sector. To be very frank, I think, with the really big tech companies, and I'm not sure, the World Bank has a lot to say, right, to balance the power. As we know that, there's also geopolitical reason in it. And recently, there's a EU also AI Act. So my personal view on this is that somehow normally these competitions and the power, they get balanced over time. But on AI and data, my concern is a little bit because of the geopolitical sensitivity of data and of AI and of cybersecurity and all of that. The digital trust is really being lost among the countries. I think this is something that we would really like to avoid, but I'm not sure what we can do. But at the national level, if we are talking about, just on a smaller scale, the relationship between government and private sector to basically bring out innovation, to bring out fit for purpose, solutions, I think that the government has a lot to contribute. Shamista, our global lead on AI is in the audience. We are looking at a policy lab, right? Is that just for different countries, we want to see how do we find the balance between, privacy, between the productive use and many other factors. So again, very much welcome, especially clients, if you are in the audience, to continue this through our policy lab. I do think policies, regulations play a critical role in, ultimately creating the enabling environment for private sector to thrive. Last but not least, on interoperability. Again, when I started at the bank about 25 years ago, I was working on telecom. So interoperability at that time basically means, you have a telephone number. What is the portability, right, between one company to another? And now, of course, with data and AI and everything, interoperability is so much more complex. What I see is that this is also an area before, right? You see also a lot of digital systems being created by different ministries, precisely because data is power. Everybody wants to own it, everybody wants to own the system. But now, actually, there are a lot of technology innovations. We are focusing a lot on digital public infrastructure. These are the building blocks, right, in terms of digital ID, payment system, and data sharing. We are active in 70 countries. Interoperability is the name of the game, because now you can build these building blocks that enable individual ownership of data by different agencies, but provides this interoperable and hopefully also inclusive data sharing platform. So you still own your data, but there are certain parts you share with others. But the incentives for sharing is really that you can also access others' data to produce more powerful services, right? And then you get more users, and then your services will be used more. It's not necessarily happening everywhere, but I do see hope in this to break down the silos due to technology innovations.
Thank you, Christine. We have come to time. Thank you for your thought-provoking questions. Thank you, our panelists, for all the hard work and for joining us today. I told you your patience would pay off. Thank you for joining us, and over to Johannes for our concluding remarks. Thank you.
Many thanks.